My name's Andy Murray, the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our podcast, following up on our seminar from a few weeks ago regarding reimagining global supply chains in the context of major projects. And what's really interesting is when we set up the seminar, it was a suggestion that came from our programme committee, who were responsible for helping us put our forward programme of events together. And when we imagined our reimagining of global supply chains, the sort of context we had in mind was obviously the impact of COVID and what we saw went on with people being affected for self-isolation and so on, and how immediate our supply chains have become and how quickly we have these backlogs or shortages when we have some of those little hiccups. We also had in mind issues relating to Brexit and the changing rules and legislation and workforce impacts that was having and is likely to have. And of course, we also had in mind, factors relating to net zero and how can, supply chains be a massive part of the solution rather than necessarily part of the problem, in particular when it comes to major projects. What we didn't have in mind was that by the time the seminar came around, that there was going to be a war in Ukraine and the impacts of sanctions and the impact on things like the gas supply and therefore the impact on cost of energy, but also the fluctuation in the price of oil, which moved massively from when we decided we were going to do the seminar to when we held it a few weeks ago. And then there are other factors like the global shortage of microchips and what we're seeing, some of the things that are going on where different industries even are competing to secure those microchips so that they don't interrupt their manufacturing and on ongoing retail sales. And then even from when we held it, we were discussing ports and the role that ports play, and we couldn't imagine that just a few days later we would have the issues over Russian ships being sanctioned and either not being allowed to come in or are being allowed to come in and being held, and then the P&O ferries workforce challenge. So we had a lot going on, and so it was an interesting discussion I felt we had that we couldn't have imagined we were going to have at the time when we put it on. So I'm joined today by a few of the speakers and the attendees from the session, and we're just going to reflect on some of the points that we discussed at the seminar, just to embellish them a little bit more, and also for the benefit of the listeners who were unable to attend the event and perhaps would rather listen to us than read some of the reports that we produce. So to get us going, we'll just do a quick once around our virtual room for our panelists this morning to introduce themselves, and then we'll crack on with some of our discussions. So I'll start with you, Ruth. Would you like to introduce yourself? So who are you, where you're from, and what's your background?
So hi everybody, my name's Ruth Todd. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at HS2, which kind of speaks for itself. My background's quite varied. So I spent 35 years in industry, starting out with a good slug of time in automotive. And then for the past few years have been working in the public sector, first of all supporting the Army, then supporting the Navy and the submarine enterprise. And then just prior to joining HS2, I ran the vaccine programme for the UK. So I guess that's my quick potted history, Andy.
Great, thank you, Ruth. And you were our chair for our events, and so thank you once again. Brilliant chair, and we've had great feedback for how effortlessly you made it appear. So I think that's always a great sign of a good chair. So thanks, Ruth. Professor Michael, would you like to introduce yourself?
Michael doesn't matter. So I'm Mike Lewis. I'm a professor of operations and supply management at the University of Bath School of Management, where I've been for the last 16, 17 years now. And I guess I was asked as the academic on the panel to be provocative. I hope I have some skin in the game. I expect I like my work to be applied in a true meaning of the word. But I try to push our thinking perhaps a few years further down the line than the immediacy of now. Although of course a lot of things we discussed are foreshadowing the future.
Great, thank you, Michael. And you were definitely provocative, and also you used some different techniques. So at one point comparing what we were discussing and introducing the which doctor was the best doctor in Doctor Who. So that's
No,
the first time I believe
there was no debate about that, Andy. I think I said it was Tom Baker.
that's true.
Scientific fact.
But it's definitely the first time Doctor Who's ever come up in one of our seminars. So thank you very much for that. Shaun, same questions to you.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Shaun McCarthy. I'm a Director of Action Sustainability, and I'm also Chair of something called the Supply Chain Sustainability School, which is a collaboration in the construction sector around upskilling the supply chain. My background, I started life as an engineer, but most of my background is in procurement. I had 10 years with Shell and 11 years with BAA. Over that time in BA, my career got progressively greener, and I got more and more into sustainability in the late 90s. In 2006, I made a decision to pack in having a proper job, and I did two things. I took a role as chair of the Commission for a Sustainable London 2012. This was an oversight body providing assurance of the promise that the London 2012 Olympics will be the most sustainable games ever. That was quite a high-profile role, reporting directly to the political leaders. I started Action Sustainability, which is still a small business. We employ 30 odd people. Our specialism is in sustainability in supply chains, and through that business we run the Supply Chain Sustainability School as the delivery partner.
Great, thank you very much, Shaun. And lastly, Richard, same questions to you.
Yes, hi, Richard Ballantyne, Chief Executive of the British Ports Association. So we are a trade association, the National Trade Association for Ports and Harbours, representing around 400 ports, piers, jetties, marine terminals up and down the country. My background is policy, legislation, public affairs and lobbying, and particularly focused on transport policy and trade policy.
Great, thank you, Richard. So I'm just going to start with you, if I may, Ruth, regarding one of the things you said in your chair's introduction, and that was around, supply chains need to be prepared for the unknowns because hiccups will happen. They're an inevitability that there will be challenges in the supply chain. So what sort of things can major projects do to help them address these unknowns?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's kind of my life's work, I think, to be absolutely ahead of the game, because there is always something you hadn't expected that's going to happen, whether it's inflation, which is, I think, going to be a real subject for us over the next few years, whether it's the genuine effect of climate change, which is another thing I'm really worrying about at the moment. There are lots of things that we don't yet know, aren't there? And we can have a pretty good punt at a list of them. And that's where it starts, I think, is going, so what are the sort of things we ought to be prepared for? Things like global unrest and a pandemic would have been on that list if we sit back and think about it, because they're known as risks that the world is expecting. So first of all, have some foresight and think a little bit about what the future might hold. And then to support that, there are a couple of sort of key ingredients for me. First is to know your supply chain. So I'm an advocate of supply chain mapping. So that's understanding down into the tiers of supply who is enabling your output. And that's working collaboratively with a number of partners into the supply chain, being deeper in that. So adding into that some categorization, I guess. So looking at those areas where you have higher risk and looking more deeply into those. And in those where you've got lower risk, being a bit shallow. So you've got to be measured and proportionate in the work that you do. But that visualization and understanding of what's going on, both from a geographic perspective, and that served us. We've been doing that. I've been doing that for the last few roles. So submarines and vaccines and HS2 have pretty good geographic understanding of their supply chains in submarines down to tier 10. It really helps when something like a conflict happens or something like a pandemic happens that's going to put friction into borders, and that knowledge is really helpful to you to understand. And then last but not least, how you manage your data. So the other sort of key thing I'm very keen on is making sure that we have strong performance understanding of our supply chain. So you understand areas of fragility, areas of risk, areas that are likely to not be as robust when they're presented with challenge. And that those two big things, visibility and visualization of your supply chain and the data that you hold about your supply chain, are really good preparations, alongside thinking a little bit about what the future might hold and just imagining some of the things you might need to be prepared for.
Great, thank you, Ruth. There's a lot of top tips to unpick from that one. I'm sure people will probably want to rewind and listen to that a few times. So thank you for that. Michael, one of the things you mentioned in your talk, and also in the Q&A that came from the attendees of the seminar, was like avoiding the use of the term supply chain, and then I was sat at the back thinking, how bad is that of us that we've titled an event and the name of it in itself is perhaps part of the issue. And you talked about supply systems, in that it's not a straight sort of top to bottom linear chain of activity. Can you sort of explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I don't really know. Well, I know exactly the provenance of the word chain, but it's one of those things that gets thrown into a conversation, becomes amplified because people find it a useful shorthand, and suddenly it becomes the subject of the conversation. But it's such a powerful metaphor that it frames our thinking about it. And of course, if you think about it, metal links click together that pull in one direction only, that won't work if you push them in the other direction, that don't give any sense of the hinterland of these supply systems. And I deliberately use that word. And I agree with almost everything Ruth said in her introduction, in particular the idea of the visualization and understanding what that system looks like. That's lecture 2 in supply management for me. But is this idea of tier is a bit similar. It implies a kind of staged gate logic that isn't really there. One has to only look at and I think I use this as a comment rather than a slide, but only has to look at the Grenfell Tower investigation and look at the systems that had evolved around the provision of what was an apparently quite simple artifact onto a refurb of a building, to see the connections left and right and up and down and loops back and forth where people supply to a company who supply back to them, who supply to a third firm who supply back to them, with subcontracting of some of the work and not all of the work, different kinds of contractual arrangements. And to think about that as a chain is to oversimplify. So our metaphors mustn't oversimplify. And again, Ruth's introduction is powerful here. When we recognize complexity, when we recognize volatility, then it being too simplified in our thinking is not our friend. And so that's my key. Think about where are the nodes, where are the connections between those nodes. If you must have a word, use network. So you can think about it as a pattern in space. But again, don't think that where you start in that process is the end of that system, that there's stuff going on after you as well. We're often quite egocentric. In fact, there's a phrase of that in network theory, the egocentric network, where we think of ourselves as the focal node, when in reality, it's something a long way further down. And in major projects, of course, normally it's the public, and they can get forgotten in some of these conversations very easily. So yeah, I banish it, and I banish it both as a provocation and as a way of starting to think differently about the supply system that organizations find themselves dealing with.
And that sort of recognition that it's complex, and perhaps overcome our inbuilt need to simplify things. I think you gave Grenfell as the example there, but that complexity means that by definition it's quite difficult to understand responsibilities and accountability. But if we've simplified it in our own mind and our own sort of models, then we can give ourselves false confidence that there is an easily defined approach to responsibility and accountability, and that's where perhaps these things break down. So it's a really good point. So thank you, Mike. So Richard, coming on to you, supports are a part of that system, and if we want to reimagine, the system that will help our major projects going forward, then we need to think about our ports, and particularly for our infrastructure projects. I mean, not all of our major projects are infrastructure, but if we just focus on those for the moment. And of course, ports take a lot of investment, and that investment might play out over a period of time. One of the things you mentioned was how much money is being spent on ports each year. Can you remind us of how much that is?
Yes, it's 1.2 billion in the last year of COVID, so to now. So quite a substantial amount of funding, and that is privately drawn from a mixture of types of investors, both international types, big pension funds, infrastructure groups, etc., but also from traditional lenders, high street banks, etc., for smaller projects across probably around 100 or so ports that are doing any projects at any one time, ranging from relatively modest sized investments of tens of thousands up to £300 million for new facilities, new berths at London Gateway, or £400 million for a new South Harbour at Aberdeen.
And of course, our wish to simplify things, it would be easy to think of all of our ports as being the same, but just serving different parts of the country. But I think you mentioned that they're all very different in terms of their capabilities and the facilities that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. And different ports do different things, as we always say in our sector. And just look at the trade outlook. You've got unitized trade, things like containers and accompanied and unaccompanied roll-on, roll-off freight with lorries and trailers being dragged on. You've also got liquid bulks, oil products, etc., which has been in the news lately because of the effects of the global situation and Russia and sanctions following their invasion into Ukraine. And then other dry bulks, project cargoes, etc. All these ports do things in different ways. And what we don't have in the UK is a big sort of super hub ports area like Rotterdam or Antwerp, etc., where you have clusters, huge clusters around a particular key gateway for a huge part of Europe, as they do in the Netherlands, for example. Ours are more spread around, which I would say has benefits as well, because it gives importers and traders choice. There's competition in the market, keeps prices down, and gives people and shipping lines different options to go into different regions. So we have a wonderfully competitive market, but I would say that along with that, we have sort of certain other issues that arise, such as familiarisation with supply chains. And I think Ruth and Mike, I fully agree with their opening statements. One thing I think was very impressive about Ruth is that knowledge and that understanding that if you're going to go into some major project from a procurement point of view, from a sourcing point of view, you need to have the understanding of where things come from, etc. The only handbrake point I would add to that is, but not many people do have that knowledge. So we have a huge amount to teach people. People need to understand where things are coming from, why costs rise, etc. And it's tough for us because we're just one part of the supply chain.
Yes, and I'm going to my next comment is partly to manufacture a nice segue to Shaun in terms of sustainability, but of course our ports also serve all of our wind farms that we've got around the country. As an island nation, we've got more than our unfair share of wind farms, and that's a big business in its own right, isn't it, in terms of the ports that service those?
Yes, absolutely. So it's not just trade that ports specialise in. We also facilitate loads of hubs for offshore activities, like traditional activities like fishing and recreational leisure, but now the new industries and things to do with energy supply. You're absolutely right. Offshore renewable wind is a big opportunity for the UK, and that would mean facilitating things through our seaports. And there's a lot of competition now from ports to be the firstly the hubs for manufacturing and then mobilisation and construction, but also on a longer scale, servicing those wind farms with high skilled jobs, sometimes for up to 25 or 30 years, depending where they are. And watch this space. There'll be lots going on there. The only challenge we have is there's lots of other things that ports want to do. So there's a competition at ports for land use, for space, for capacity, for access. So it's a fairly crowded market, but it's certainly coming through the pandemic. We're feeling pretty good about ourselves as the ports industry in comparison with some other transport organisations and industries like aviation, for example, who've really been hit through travel and transport limits.
And of course, now we've got through the National Infrastructure Commission with the National Infrastructure Pipeline and with the IPA overlaying that with the government's major project portfolio, we actually do have a sort of a sense of, what demands we're likely to have on our ports to deliver those major projects over, the next 10 to 15 years. So perhaps we can be more proactive in that investment and planning rather than reactive as those major projects are going through their initiation steps. So I set up my segue on sustainability, Shaun. Sustainability came up a lot during the seminar, but I felt we didn't do a deep dive into the topic in its own right. So from your perspective, what can major projects do with respect to the supply chain to really get that jump in sustainability that we need for 2050 net zero and some other aspects around biodiversity, for example?
Yeah, major projects and clients in particular are the key driver. There's no doubt about that. And certainly from my experience on the London Olympics, I had a unique role to provide oversight to sustainability for that particular programme of work. And what that did was that led to an incredible tension in the supply chain, or the supply network, if we want to use the new expression, because the supply chain was actually required to demonstrate its performance against some very clear sustainability targets. So a major project needs to set its stall out, be very, very clear what the expectation is of the supply chain, and then to follow it up. And certainly, again, I'm completely agreeing with a lot of Ruth's earlier comments about understanding what that performance really looks like. Now, what happened on the Olympics as a result of that was the main contractors, the tier one contractors, suddenly realized that their supply chain was not competent to deliver on those sustainability objectives. That they didn't know how to measure it. It gave rise to a Tower of Babel of spreadsheets all over the place, and loads of people arguing about data up and down the value chain and across it, but also recognizing that down there in the multiple tiers of supply chain in the construction sector, the knowledge wasn't there. And sad to say, it's improved, but it still isn't. It needs to get better. And that was why we started the supply chain school. It was that there was a direct correlation between the work on the Olympics, the demand from a major project, and then the need to upskill that supply chain so they actually understand what's expected of them and how to deliver it. And if we fast forward then to projects like HS2, that has been replicated. That demand, very clear target setting, objective setting, requiring those suppliers to actually report on their performance and to quantify what they're doing within the value chain is really, really important. So I can't emphasize enough the role of the client in all of this. If you work with as I do, most of the tier one contractors in the construction sector and also outside construction, and I run exercises with their senior executives to say, well, what are your key drivers? What's driving you to be sustainable? The client always comes out top. If the client doesn't ask, then quite frankly, a lot of them don't do it. Things are improving. I am seeing contractors these days with their own sustainability objectives, and they are starting to drive the agenda. But ultimately, it's all about the client.
Great. That's thanks, Shaun. So our listeners who are sort of regular readers of our highlights report will know that we often finish the report with a further considerations or further points for discussion that was sort of came out of the seminar, but we still need to delve in further. And actually, one of the 3 points that our report writer picked up on was the very point you just made, Shaun, which is the role of the client in sort of setting the tone around sustainability and other factors. So it's a question, I'll put this out to all of you if anyone wants to sort of wave and come in, which is, what initiatives are there? What can we do to help influence clients thinking about being more resilient in regard to how they work with their supply chain or supply network? Mike, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of things, right? And the question of capability in terms of both the skills, so what Shaun's talking about there, knowledge, awareness is critical for it. But equally, I think in just sheer quanta of capability, I think a lot of organizations, better buying gives you better supply chains. It's not very difficult. But if you have a very, very thin buying activity and it's spread across, my description of a system with all that complexity, so many facets, Ruth's aspiration to be forward looking as well. So you multiply up again the number of questions you're having to ask that team. There just needs to be more of them. And I think from government down through that system, there's not enough really great buying. Now, I would say that maybe, wouldn't I? Because I trained some of those people. Shaun might say the same, but it's clearly true that we've tried to make that too thin an activity when it needs to be a really fat activity to deliver that capability. So that would be my first aspiration. Better buying gives you better supply systems, but better buying needs more capability, which will include more people. And I hope that's where we're in terms of travel. But the thing I said at the end of the last conversation on the panel was we're competing then for the same people that every other functional activity is competing for, and that's going to be a profound challenge. But better buying, better capability.
So I guess I'd probably sit in a fairly unique position because I've been both client and supplier, and have run some pretty gritty, difficult contracts. Mostly my sort of mid-term career was going in where things weren't working and trying to fix them, and usually when my client was pretty angry with us. So the challenge when you're in that situation is who faints first. And my favourite expression is, so who's going to collaborate first? And that I agree about buying, but there's a whole period after you've bought in a major project where you are running a contract. And my preferred situation is the contract sits in the drawer and we're spending our time working about how we deliver our outcomes. And the challenge when things aren't going well is how to have those conversations in a way that doesn't put anyone in a harm situation, but allows you to get under the skin of the things that aren't working. And when things are going well, to leverage the things that are going well to be even better. And that collaboration for me is the key, I think, in terms of initiatives from my perspective as both a supplier and a client, in allowing us to have meaningful conversations, often gritty when stuff's going badly, quite exciting when things are going well and inspiring, but being able to talk about it and put everyone's cards on the table and be transparent and know the situation, back to my data point, know actually what's going on rather than what people say is going on, is really helpful for both the supply side of the conversation and the client side of the conversation. But I recognise the responsibility as a client because everything I'm responsible for is delivered through somebody else. As HS2, I think we've got a reasonable relationship with our first tier suppliers, and we're currently exploring what that means down into our supply chains, because we're not yet convinced that we've created that same ethos and culture into the supply network, and it is genuinely a network. Mike's point is very well made, because there are a number of suppliers who are prevalent across our supply network as well as down into it. So it is an incredibly complex system, but to know how to get the best from each of them will make us successful as a client. And that's not just a linear bilateral relationship, it's a relationship that sits across that network. So there's a lot of soft skills in it, is my answer to the question. Which initiatives are there? The soft skills are the ones that are most powerful.
Yeah, and it's interesting because collaboration was one of the other sort of further points for consideration that came up. And I was thinking about that after the event, in that the collaboration, when we put it in the context of the system that Mike's been talking about, isn't necessarily client to supplier, but it could be client to client. So collaborating in terms of use of scarce resources across different clients. So I'm aware, in terms of some discussions I've had recently over the national shortage of archaeologists, and since we've got lots of infrastructure projects going on, that something that can hold up a project where you need to go and do some investigation, then having access to those archaeologists can be the difference between the the delay that could be caused and some of the additional benefits that can come from schemes. Richard, you've got your hand up, being very polite. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, just a slightly kind of, I guess, a left field comment or suggestion. Now, we've worked, as the port sector, we've worked very closely with various government departments over the last 5-6 years in the run-up for the UK's departure from things like the European Customs Union and the single market, which have effectively been political decisions. We understand why those political decisions were made, etc., and why policymakers wanted to push forward with those aspirations. But what I think it highlighted is there was a general lack of understanding at both government and industry level about what the implications of the UK's departure from the European Union was from a trade and logistics and supply chain point of view. And that's not anyone's fault, I would suggest. However, we can look at ways to enlighten policymakers and industry. I wouldn't say that civil servants, officials and ministers are alone in not understanding the full breadth and complexity of our supply chains. And a slightly kind of unusual suggestion, we need to have more focus in government on supply chains, logistics, and you can throw in sourcing for big public sector projects into that, although where I'm coming from is more a sort of national resilience point of view. And instead of, for example, having BAYS standalone or having the Department for Transport looking at transport issues or other government departments when it becomes relevant to their portfolio, I wonder whether we need a part of government that just focuses on supply chains, trade thrown in with that, UK resilience, etc. Now, that's not going to solve the world, but it does keep a hardcore of government officials looking at this agenda instead of them being at, for example, the HMRC, looking at customs processes, 1 year and then being moved over to look at VAT or other tax opportunities, etc., which are not really connected to supply chains. So we're keen to see a bit more focus on how you do that, and also bringing in industry, academia, Mike, etc. We need to get people who have experience in these sectors working in government. And it was great to see the initiative to have Sir Dave Lewis, the former chief executive of Tesco's, being brought in to advise the government last year, but nothing really came of it, unfortunately. And that's not a criticism of Dave Lewis. It just sort of petered out. I don't know whether that was more a sort of PR piece. We're going to do something, and perhaps Dave Lewis was very wealthy in his knowledge and experience, but perhaps he wasn't quite the right person for that. Perhaps we needed someone a bit more kind of lowbrow, someone a bit more kind of in the nuts and bolts of trade, etc., to come in and lead these kind of things. But yeah, it's slightly wacky and out there, but let's have a think about how we can improve understanding across government, but also in industry.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In the vaccine task force, if you read the NAO interim report, one of the things they said was it was the ability to bring a group together that worked across government departments that enabled that that initiative to be so successful. And I think what you just sort of eloquently highlighted there, Richard, the challenge where you've got different departments having an impact on the sort of resilience of the supply system and the role of ports from your perspective in particular. Sadly, we're getting towards the end of our roundtable discussion, so I'm going to finish with one last question, and I'll do it in reversed order so we get a bit of symmetry to our podcast. So I'll start with Shaun, and my question is, if I could give you a magic wand and you could wave it only once, and bear in mind that our session was reimagining global supply chains, so we now use that sort of future time frame. So let's set a time frame of 5 years. So if we can imagine a significantly improved supply chain or supply network in 5 years' time, what would have been done to have enabled that? So Shaun, what would your magic wand be used to change to get that improvement that we would like to see?
What I would like to see is the type of interaction between supply chains in 5 years' time that we were actually doing on Heathrow Terminal 5 in the 1990s, where the key suppliers are pre-selected against an agreement and required to work together and interesting kind of commercial techniques where, there's a risk pot and money is taken out of the risk pot on a no blame, no fault basis, that the project is insured across the piece and not by individual contractors. There are examples of very large projects that follow that type of philosophy, but the vast majority of projects do not. We still have the traditional tiered from top to bottom supply chain, where subcontractors are treated very, very badly down the value chain. People are not employed under good conditions, and everybody pushes risk down to the organisation that is least able to deal with it. I would like to see that go away on all of our projects.
Great, thank you, Shaun. So that's something for us to come back and revisit in 5 years' time, or through the journey to get there in 5 years' time. So, Richard, same question to you. What's your magic wand going to be used for?
I'd be a bit negative. There probably isn't a magic wand. There's nothing we can do. This is very much a market-led sector. Unless we're going to, suddenly change our sort of government strategy and get government sort of hands-on supply chain, start running shipping lines, etc. I think it's just something we need to be more resilient, I would say. We need to be more accepting. I think there was quite an interesting debate at the conference we had about, the various kind of extreme experiences we've had in terms of the pandemic, Brexit, etc. And I think, as I pointed out, although yes, the pandemic was absolutely massive, and Brexit is a huge challenge for us to get used to, there's always been issues that get kind of focus the mind of policymakers. They get us very excited in the media, etc. And I think we need to be a bit more resilient to those and understand this is going to come, and it's part of supply chain management. Is you're going to have to deal with problems and challenges, and we're going to have to toughen up and prepare strategically for them. So I would just suggest, in the era of 24-hour news and social media, etc., that we just have a calming, kind of measured process to these things, and we only react when it really is getting serious. And otherwise, we just need to kind of get our heads around and understand supply chains much better.
Thanks, Richard. So if you're not using your magic wand, I'm going to take it back and use it to hope that Arsenal win the Premier League next season. So there we go, reused it. So Mike, over to you.
Well, I'm not going to echo that. If I advocate for a systems perspective, then one of the things you learn very quickly is don't chase that magic lever, that magic bullet, because that can make things worse. And I hope I conveyed that in my presentation, but it's a lot of supply chain challenge is stuff we do to ourselves. Even without talking about policy at the macro level, stuff we do to ourselves with the wrong communication of the wrong data at the wrong time and the wrong pricing incentive. So I think that systems perspective requires us to take a step back. But that's not to diminish, and this is my other complementary message, the profound urgency of the challenges we face. And we didn't talk enough about climate change, but all of the things we have been talking about are, as I said, a foreshadow of that. Food, if we think about energy disruption we are facing now, that is not going to go away as we transition from one form of energy source to another. So all that volatility, you need to treat it as a kind of training ground for what's coming. The big challenge is, have we got the energy? I see a lot of very tired people out there. And again, that reflects my plea for more people, more capability, because if we keep asking the same brilliant people like Ruth to do more and more and more and more, we will break them.
Great, thank you, Mike. I think you used your one then, because I was about to steal it back and wish for the Champions League the year after, but I think you did actually use it. So thank you. So Ruth, last question to you. What would you use your one for?
Yeah, well, I'm not a believer in one, so there you are. You can get your second wishing. Although being someone who follows the odd-shaped ball, I'm not really sure I'm that wild about a football outcome. And as a rugby mum, it's definitely something that I'm very close to. So I guess I'm going to come at this slightly differently and say, what do I aspire to? What direction do I want to travel in, rather than expecting to be able to achieve that ultimate outcome? And for me, I want a world where I really talk about carbon and I talk about sustainability, and that's a much more predictable world where I talk about the next crisis. So I'm going to talk aspirationally rather than practically, which is, for those who know me will know that's quite unusual. I really want to be in a world where our focus is on the carbon agenda, where we're thinking about looking after our world and our supply chains are there to make that happen. I want a world that's much more predictable, and I can guess what's going to happen next, and therefore take the stress away from my people, because they are able to work in a way that is more predictable and is more comfortable for them to be in. And try and help make sure that my kids' futures are in good shape. So that's my aspiration. It's not a magic one thing, it's a direction of travel for me rather than something we'll ever get to. The complexity of our network of supply, our challenges that come near term, one on top of another, mean that will always be something that's challenging to achieve, but we have to have a focus in a direction, and that for me is where we should be headed.
Great, thank you, Ruth. And I think that's a sentiment, and in fact all of your responses that we'll all, we can all agree with and get behind, and links really well to the association's 2025 strategy, where we've set out 3 landmark objectives, and one of those is around moving the dial on environmental sustainability for major projects, also diversity across major projects, and leadership capability we see as a key enabler for the other 2 to happen. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the time you gave in preparing for and presenting at our seminar, but also then following up and giving us your time again today. I think it just adds to the richness of our events that we can have some of these follow-up conversations. And for those people listening, thank you very much for your time to download or to click on the link of whichever your podcast platform of choice is. And just to let you know that if you want to read the full report and the highlights report, you can find them from the association website, where you can delve into some of these points in a little bit more detail. So thank you very much.